Good evening and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French. We're going to spend much of this hour focusing on COVID, the push to reopen our schools, the debate in Washington as the party squaring off on another possible COVID relief bill. But before we get to any of that, we first take you to Washington. That is where the body of the late Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis lies in state under the Capitol Rotunda. It is the first time this highest legislative memorial has ever been done for an African-American lawmaker. In a few minutes, Lewis's body will be moved to the steps of the Capitol so members of the public can walk past and honor him themselves. And that is just one of the many honors for the man who played both a critical role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and also in our American government for the final 35 years of his remarkable life. The body of John Lewis was led by police escort on a touching farewell tour of some of Washington's most iconic landmarks: the Martin Luther King Memorial, the National Museum of African American History, and Black Lives Matter Plaza, where he made one of his last public appearances. A final journey through the nation's capital before lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda.
Here in Congress, John was revered and beloved on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol.
The civil rights icon represented Georgia in the House for more than 30 years, where today lawmakers in the lower chamber unanimously voted to rename a voting rights bill after him, a fitting tribute for the man credited with changing history.
Today, we pray and trust that this peacemaker himself now rests in peace.
Both former Vice President Biden and Vice President Pence paying their respects as Lewis lies in state. However, President Trump says he will not. The two had a contentious relationship. Lewis did not attend Trump's inaugural and each of the State of the Union addresses except this year's. In Lewis' home state of Alabama, red rose petals scattered on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where he marched and bled for the right to vote on March 7, 1965. The date later became known as Bloody Sunday. This past Sunday, he crossed that bridge one last time. Lewis returned to the bridge in Selma year after year, bringing bipartisan delegations with him, most notably in 2015 with President Obama, who credited Lewis with helping to make his presidency possible. Lewis wasn't just a powerful advocate for African American rights. He was widely admired because his principles stand for justice for all groups, including for the rights of LGBTQ Americans, the parents and children of immigrants held in camps while seeking asylum, and for the many victims of gun violence in America. There is no way for us to fully share the story of John Lewis or to explain the impact his life had on tens of millions of Americans, if not more. But Congressman James Clyburn, he can. Clyburn, a longtime congressman from South Carolina, and not just a colleague, but a friend of the late Congressman Lewis. He served with Lewis both in the House and the Congressional Black Caucus for the past 27 years. Congressman Clyburn, thank you very much. You know, I don't know why this stood out to me, Congressman, but someone had said that if Emmett Till was still with us, he'd still be younger than John Lewis. And just the scope of what the late Congressman went through over the course of his life. And listen, I only met him a few times in person, but there was no edge to him, at least that I saw. And I couldn't believe for what he had endured that the bitterness didn't carry over. Did I just get him on a good day, or was that who he was?
That's who he was. John and I both came into Martin Luther King Jr.'s orbit right around the same time. We were the same age. He was just a few months older. He came into the movement. He was about 15 years old. I started hanging out with NAACP stuff around the same age. Now, we met in October of 1960 when we were both 20-year-olds. And John was only 23 years old when he was on that bridge in Selma, leading the march of some 600 people. But John was different from the rest of us. We had accepted, I would say adopted, King's nonviolence as a tactic. John internalized it. It became his way of life. John held no bitterness. The kind of things that he absorbed in the name of nonviolence, I couldn't have done. There's no way in the world I probably wouldn't be here now, but I don't know if I could have taken the kind of stuff that he took.
I ask you, Congressman, with the seeing what's going on in the world today, when you and your old friend spoke in this last crazy 6 months, did you look at where we are at this moment with optimism, or are you really worried, not just the pandemic, but, you know, how did it bring you back to the 60s? Where do you think we are at this moment, and do you think we're going to come out on the better side for it?
Yes, John and I talked earlier this year about the Black Lives Matter movement after the incident with George Floyd, the lynching, I would say, of George Floyd. John and I talked about that. And you know, it was almost immediately after that, we started seeing these headlines, defund the police. And John and I talked about that. We talked about the danger of that kind of a headline doing to the Black Lives Matter movement what Burn Baby Burn did to us back in the 60s. Many people may recall when John was chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I think he was elected in 1963. In 1966, they started this Burn Baby Burn business. They rejected nonviolence. They ousted John as chair of SNCC. John was not deterred by that. He held to his guns. And he said to me that he thought that we needed to speak out against that. And he did, and I did. You may recall, I said, those kinds of headlines might get you ahead, might make a good headline. Those kind of slogans might make a good headline, but it would not make any headway. And we should not allow this well-run effort that's gotten so much support. I think they're going to be able to do with Black Lives Matter what we did not do with SNCC. But we can't run the risk of allowing sloganeering to undercut the movement. That's why John spoke very forcefully in his latter days, saying that looting and burning are not the way to go. And I said that we ought to leave, we ought not play that game. Violence is not our game. That's their game. And one of the things you learn in sports, if you get lulled into playing the other guy's game, that guy will win. And so we can't allow ourselves to play that game, because they'll win if we do.
It was notable today, I think, that the president chose not to pay his respects. Maybe it's not a shocker to anyone, but did you say to yourself just as well? Or did you say it says something that the president couldn't at least pay his respects to the life that Congressman Lewis left?
Well, it says much more about the president than it says about John. John's life was a life well lived. And I'll tell you this. I know the current occupant of the White House has achieved the highest office in this land, maybe the most powerful office in the whole world. He will never measure up to John Lewis, will never get the respect that John Lewis has got from the American people. What we've seen, this outpouring all over the world, everybody sorry to see him go. I'm not too sure there'll be that many people sorry to see this president leave office.
Just one political question before I let you go, Congressman. At the end of the month, and it's fast approaching, a lot of people are worried they could be out of an apartment, be out of a home. They're not going to be getting the checks they need. Tell me this is just Washington posturing, or are they really going to turn off the spigot when you got tens of millions of Americans here who are worried about how they're going to keep the lights on?
Well, you know, I listened to a little bit of Mitch McConnell's speech on the floor today. My dad used to tell me all the time, son, where there is a will, there is a way. I would hope that the Republicans in the Senate will develop the will to do as much for ordinary human beings in this country as they do for corporations. And for us to callously look at those people's plight and say, I'm not going to do anything for them unless you do something for the big corporations. That is not what this country is all about. And if John Lewis were on the floor today, he would be railing against that. That is why I say John Lewis is the embodiment, or was the embodiment, of what the goodness of this country is all about. And this country is under threat of losing its basic goodness, and that will destroy its greatness.
Congressman Clyburn, I know it's been a long day. I appreciate you making a few minutes for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as we showed you briefly, the emotions in Washington today over Congressman Lewis, just one way our nation is saying farewell. Another is worth another look. Yesterday, in Selma, Alabama, John Lewis crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the final time. Back in 1965, on what would become known as Bloody Sunday, he crossed that bridge alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was the moment that began his legacy within the civil rights movement. In 1965, police responded by beating Lewis within an inch of his life. In 2020, police responded by saluting the late congressman. Congressman Lewis's body will lie in state at the Capitol again tomorrow. He will then be honored in the Georgia State House on Wednesday before a celebration of his life and his internment in Atlanta on Thursday. Congressman Lewis was 80 years old. And amid the mourning, the work continues in Washington. The focus, schools and more COVID relief. But the virus, it keeps spreading. The numbers keep climbing. Up next, the latest virus news here, and we'll talk with the top teachers union chief nationally about the push to reopen schools, health and safety be damned.